In the quiet atmosphere, the sound of the front door closing softly echoed behind me as everyone in my family went out for a rare weekend away. This time, my parents went to visit some relatives in another province, while David, my stepbrother, decided to stay home. He said he had a lot of schoolwork to finish, and I wasn't surprised since David had always been diligent and serious in his studies. But today, something felt off. The unusual silence in the house seemed to stir up my mind, making every tiny sound amplify. I kept myself busy in the kitchen, distracting myself by preparing lunch. David had been somewhat distant lately. Although we had never been particularly close since our parents married a few years ago, this newfound coldness felt strange. I could still remember those moments when he used to tease me in a friendly way, even if it was just out of courtesy. I was chopping vegetables when I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. There was something deliberate and steady about David's steps, as though he was contemplating something important. When he appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, leaning against the frame, I glanced up and met his gaze. "What are you doing today?" David asked, his voice even, yet with an undertone I couldn't quite place. "I'm making pasta. Do you want some?" I replied, trying to keep my voice light. He nodded, and unlike his usual habit, didn't leave the kitchen immediately. Instead, he stood there, staring at me with an odd look. I began to feel uneasy, sensing an awkwardness that was hard to ignore. Finally, I hesitantly asked, "Is everything okay?" David smirked slightly, but his eyes lacked their usual warmth. "You seem nervous," he said, his tone gentle, but carrying a subtle implication I couldn't discern. I smiled back awkwardly, returning my focus to chopping vegetables, my hands slightly trembling. Soon after, David moved closer, and the space between us suddenly felt uncomfortably close. I could smell his cologne, a fresh scent that seemed overly intense in the small kitchen. "You know," David said, his voice lowering, "today it's just the two of us here." David stepped nearer, his eyes tinged with curiosity, mixed with something unidentifiable as though he was probing my reaction. I felt my heart racing, my breathing becoming heavy as the space suddenly felt stifling. "Is something wrong, David?" I asked, trying to offer a soft smile despite feeling uneasy. David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he silently looked at me with a penetrating gaze. "Nothing's wrong," he smiled, but the way he spoke didn't feel casual. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a light touch but one that carried an unusual warmth, causing me to step back slightly. "You really are quite cute, Mia," he said, his gaze lingering on my face. Hearing those words stirred a mix of embarrassment and confusion within me. This was David, my stepbrother, whom I had always tried to see as family since our parents married years ago. But today, the way he spoke, his gaze, and that deep look at all felt beyond any boundary I dared to consider. "Thank you," I replied briefly, turning away to tidy the dishes, hiding my discomfort. But David remained there, not moving. He looked at me thoughtfully, his dark eyes sharp as though he was mulling over something distant. "Mia, have you ever thought about the fact that we're not really family?" he asked, his voice gentle but laced with heaviness. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm, though my tension was evident. "You know we're not blood related," David said, his voice slowing, warm. "There's no actual bond between us." I stood there, unsure how to respond. It was true, we weren't biological siblings, but ever since our parents married, I had always tried to see him as family. But now, the way David looked at me, his voice, all of it seemed to be pushing past boundaries I had never dared to consider. The kitchen became so quiet that I could hear my heartbeat. I wanted to say something to break this tension, but didn't know where to start. "What are you saying?" "We are family," I replied gently, trying to keep my voice steady. "Family, right?" David whispered, almost as if he was speaking to himself. He took another step toward me, now only a few feet away, and I could feel his breath close to me. David stood very close, his eyes locked onto mine as though trying to read my thoughts. The surrounding space seemed frozen, leaving only the tension between us. "I'm serious, Mia," David continued softly, but his tone held a difficult to decipher emotion, both sincere and hesitant. "We're really not siblings. It's just that circumstances made us share a home." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling slightly, but I tried to stay composed. "What are you talking about, David? I don't think this is important enough to discuss." "Not important?" David scoffed, a faint smile passing but leaving a strange feeling. "Have you ever wondered if things might be different if we weren't family?" I fell silent, feeling both surprised and confused. My mind spun with conflicting thoughts. David had never been one to talk this way, but today, the way he looked at me, that piercing gaze seemed to reveal a hidden truth. "David, why are you bringing this up?" I asked, trying to maintain my composure. "We should keep things as our parents wish. Family is family after all." He was silent for a moment, then unexpectedly, he leaned down, his eyes locked onto mine. "Mia, you know, ever since we met, I've always wondered why we should accept everything as it is." Those words stunned me, each one piercing through my heart. I instinctively turned my face away, avoiding his gaze. "Don't say that. We can't, David. You know that." David sighed, his voice soft but filled with hidden pain. "I know, but you understand, don't you? It's not as simple as you think. I've tried, Mia, but—" He trailed off, and I stood there, lost in a mix of emotions. Part of me understood what he was trying to convey, but another part wanted to evade it, refusing to face the truth. "David, we shouldn't continue this," I whispered, as if speaking louder would cause our feelings to overflow. He chuckled softly, his gaze softening. "I know, but feelings aren't something you can easily control, are they?" Late night, in silence with the rain outside the window. That day, I went up to my room after dinner, unable to stop thinking about the strange conversation we'd had. My mind was flooded with thoughts I'd never had before about David's words and the feelings I had tried to suppress all this time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain outside, feeling my heart race whenever David's image appeared in my mind. I told myself not to think of him this way, but the more I tried, the more overwhelming the feeling became. Then suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding. "Mia, are you still awake?" I recognized it immediately as David's voice, familiar yet sounding different. There was a hesitation in his voice, a sort of reluctance. I got up and went to open the door. "Is something wrong, David?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "I can't sleep," he replied briefly, his eyes showing a hint of turmoil. I stood there, unsure of what to say, just looking at David for a moment. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The atmosphere in the room became more stifling, as though it was too small to contain the two of us along with all the feelings we had been holding in for so long. "You shouldn't be here," I said, but my voice wavered, unable to conceal my true emotions. "Mia, I know this is wrong, but I can't keep pretending," David said, his gaze somber. "I've tried so many times to avoid these thoughts, but the more I try, the more I think about you." Those words struck me like a sharp blow to my heart. I looked at him, and in that moment, I saw in his eyes a hidden pain that I might have been carrying as well. I felt my heart beat strongly as I looked into David's eyes. His gaze seemed to say all the things we had never dared to voice. That night, the silence between us grew heavy, weighed down by emotions we had never let out. David stepped toward me, his movements slow and cautious. His gaze never left me, and I couldn't tear mine away from him. I knew we were both treading a fragile line, a forbidden area we shouldn't cross. But with every second that passed, every heavy breath he took, my reason began to dissolve. "Mia, I don't want you to misunderstand," David whispered, his voice just barely audible. "But this feeling, it's not just a mistake." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. In my mind, hundreds of thoughts spun around. I couldn't deny that there were times I'd wondered about this, if things would be different under other circumstances. But that didn't mean it was right. "David, you know we can't, right?" I shook my head, trying to resist the allure his gaze was exerting. "I don't want things to change between us." "I'm not asking you to change anything, Mia," he said softly, stepping closer. "I just want you to understand that what I feel is real." Min sighed softly, a small, resigned smile appearing. "I understand, Lan. I won't force anything, but know that you're not the only one feeling conflicted." With that, he turned and walked out of my room, leaving me standing there in silence. The door closed gently, and I was left with my own racing heart and my thoughts in chaos, unsure of what had just happened or where we would go from here.